Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fabulous webinar called Design for Bioregions. My name is Michelle Maloney, and I'm the National Convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. And before I introduce our wonderful speakers, John Thackara and James Oliver, I might just give you a little bit of an introduction to AELA. But before I do that, I'd also like to acknowledge country. If any of you are not from Australia, perhaps I can share with you that here in Australia, many of us like to acknowledge the country of the first peoples upon which we live, work and play. I live in a place that's north of Brisbane, and I'd like to acknowledge the first peoples of the Cubby lands, so the Cubby peoples, and I'd like to acknowledge that land was never ceded. There's been no treaty in this country, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I would like very much to acknowledge the elders past and present and the peoples who continue caring for country. And for those who know about AELA's work, I'll mention in just a moment what we do, but acknowledging country means an awful lot to us. We work in deep solidarity with Indigenous friends here in Australia and around the world, and we're working very actively in the Earth Laws space to try to help decolonise Western knowledge and Western supremacy of what it thinks is the right way forward in these crazy times of ecological and social justice challenges. Yeah, really want to do a call out and a welcome to everybody, and in particular to any Indigenous friends who are joining us today. So just a quick word about the Australian Earth Laws Alliance and why we're interested in bioregions and bioregioning. AELA, as we love to call her, is a very small not-for-profit organisation. Our mission has about 10 years to help spread the joy of earth-centered thinking. Seriously, our job is to increase the understanding and practical implementation of earth-centered governance. And by governance, we really are talking about the rules that human beings make to live, work and play together. We're inspired both by Western deep ecology and a wonderful thinker and writer, Thomas Berry, who called himself a geologian, and his book, The Great Work, which critiques the underpinning structures of modern industrialised societies. And in his work, he actually points to bioregions and bioregional scale governance and cultural development as a wonderful starting point for many societies who have disconnected from nature to reconnect. And so we're passionate about bioregions because actually we're passionate about place. We love the uniqueness of landscape and waterways and creatures, and biodiversity and plants. But we also know it's a fantastic way to integrate our thinking about building an earth-centered system of governance. So that's why AELA has been around for a while doing education and a whole range of community-based work. And we also connect to lots of international networks. And it's why we're hosting our webinar series. We are calling Exploring Bioregioning. And without further ado, I'd actually like to introduce John Thackara and James Oliver. And John's going to speak first. And John is a total legend, and I'm totally in love with his work. And now I've completely embarrassed him. Mission accomplished. But I'm really delighted that John and James are going to talk with us about what design is all about in the bioregional space. And then we're going to have a bit of a discussion, the three of us, and then we'll go to your questions, which hopefully will pop up in the chat when you're ready. So I'm going to jump off screen, and perhaps John, if you'd like to just start and introduce yourself in whichever hat you're wearing today, that would be lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. We're just at the seemingly never-ending heat wave here, so I'm not wearing a hat. But we've had a couple of chats before this meeting, which I'm looking forward to tremendously. But then we got the opening question from Michelle is, what is design and what has it got to do with bioregioning? Which is a nice, easy one, of course not. And so basically, I want to spend no more than 10 minutes summarizing everything I've learned so far in 74 years, which is, of course, a piece of cake. But it does mean I'm going to read out some words in case I miss out some incredibly vital insight. But thank you, Michelle, for that hard way to start my 6 o'clock in the morning day. But what is design? Wherever you're sitting, the desk, the clothes you're wearing, the laptop or the device you're looking at, even this small spoon has been designed. Italians, I don't know if there are any Italians here, to say that design extends from the spoon to the city. And these days, of course, it's so much more than just that. What's on the screen of your device, just coming into this webinar, That's another whole universe which has been created more or less from nothing during my lifetime. How you interact with it, what happens when you scroll, when you tap, what happens when you do something like click on search, a universe of digital actions takes place, and maybe an answer appears, or maybe you start a conversation with your device or the AI that's inhabiting it. The man-made world is amazing. I think we can agree with that. Whether it's good, amazing, or bad is we were going to discuss. But what I'm starting from is the notion that when I began my career and my work as basically a journalist and a curator, the whole world of cyberspace, the intangible and visible side of it all, didn't even exist. But what I've learned as somebody like all of you here, trying to, in a lifetime, to understand why we behave so badly on this planet, which is our only home, is that it's not really per se about evil people doing evil things, although there's plenty of those about. It's more that the artificial world, the man-made world, is so absorbing, so all-encompassing, so mesmerizing, that it's increasingly distracted our attention from the natural world, of which we're all the origins of. So I come back to my exhibit A, the spoon, and here is some soil which I collected from outside my office just before we started. So this 1 teaspoonful of soil, as I guess many of it, is teeming with life, millions, billions of microorganisms. I'm quite proud of my soil. I don't grow very much, but I have a rather splendid small compost heap. I call it a nature reserve for worms. The point being that I didn't know anything. I hadn't thought about this until a few years ago when I started to meet with people who had become somewhat obsessed and mesmerized by soil. It was not part of my thinking at all, despite years and years of trying in a very cerebral way to think about this word sustainability. And so that one realization from other people that this soil underneath our feet, underneath the cities where we live, is teeming with life, doing its thing. Without a healthy soil, we'd all be finished. We'd be done for very quickly. But we don't, for the most part, think about soil, still less do anything very meaningful to make sure that it's healthy. On the contrary, one of the ways you could define the modern age is that it's about concreting over the soil and piling more and more man-made structures of different scales on top of it. From the spoon to the city, yeah, that's a history of disregard for life itself, but that is changing. And that brings me onto the word bioregion and bioregioning, because I've been looking for many years for some way to distract my attention or attract my attention away from the man-made and towards the natural, not as alternatives, but just to enlarge our understanding. And the word bioregion, I've concluded, attracts a lot of people, as Michelle just said, for quite diverse reasons. And people, I've discovered, read onto and into the word many different things, as we'll find out today. But one way to think about it is the word contains bio. It's a kind of reference to nature, to living things, to life that is not entirely created by human beings. And through the word bio, it touches the lack that we feel, even if we don't articulate it and even if we don't act on it, our lack of contact with the natural world. And then region, as in bioregion, it's another word for local, but less kind of small and claustrophobic than local often appears to people. So region has a bigger sort of connotation. Lots of people have written about bioregion as a geographical concept that embraces natural borders and natural sheds like watersheds and so on, rather than the man-made ones. Lots of very wise and people have written about from Thomas Maybury onwards. I don't know if you saw Naomi Klein's piece a few weeks ago about here-ness. I think bioregioning is another way to think about here-ness. It actually begins to get us to concentrate on where we are rather than on some distant place. But Michelle asked, what has design got to do with bioregioning? I think, and she already said the words, thereby stealing my conclusion, it's about caring for place. I personally don't think bioregioning and caring for place are two different things. On the contrary, I think that there's all hundreds and one marvelous ways in which people are learning how to reconnect with place. in many ways reconnecting through the guidance and the learning from indigenous peoples who've been connected to place for generations and very kindly share that knowledge in different ways. But I do think that there are some ways in which design and designing can enhance our reconnection with place in ways that we might otherwise not find easy to do. So the first thing that designers can do is to see places with fresh eyes and discover forms of value that maybe other people don't look for. They can design new ways of gathering, association, and social connection. Designers love designing meetings and formats and concept for gathering together online for more parts, but now increasingly looking to see if they can find real world, real place, real bioregional gatherings. Thirdly, designers can make change happen, which is otherwise just a discussion, by making products prototypes or service prototypes. In other words, making an example of something like, I don't know, a compost heap with enhanced measurement of its internal heat with a kind of feed to a phone to tell you when the compost heap needs tending to, which some people at MIT have done. There are practical acts of care which the designers use their skills, but where the actual need is coming from living more closely, for example, to the soil. And then there are basically the hundreds and hundreds of practical acts of care that are happening around the world right now. Community gardens, river cafes, repair cafes, cooperative housing, time banks, and so on. These don't all usually get lumped under the heading of bioregioning, but if we allow me to mess up the whole hour that we have ahead, if bioregioning is a subset of caring for place, then there's an awful lot of caring for place going on around the world. And then I think that Michelle also mentioned, and certainly in the conversations we had before, designers have a slight reputation for thinking they can do everything. And one or two of them can, but most of them probably can't do as much as they would like to think. There's a huge and very, I think, reassuring wave of humility and openness to learning in the designers that are coming into this world of place, care, and bioregioning, looking at the reality that in order to understand a place, they need to collaborate with all sorts of different people, not just scientists like geologists and so on, and topographers, but regular, so to speak, inhabitants of places know more about places than most designers do. So there's a whole world of reaching out to say, please, can I learn with you about the place? Similarly, there's so many groups of people who are mapping social assets, the people who know about things, buildings, practices, cultural traditions, which are already there and have been there for a long time, even if they've been evolving, but where designers, with their particular skill set and particular can-do approach, can be fantastically good additions to the mix in making these practices richer, more adaptable, more joyful in different ways. And so what I'm describing is bioregioning in plain sight. I hope one of the conclusions of today is we're not introducing to some very exotic activity that, only a small priesthood is unable to properly understand. There are people in the bioregioning community with a small c who have a slightly rarefied view of how complicated it all is or how necessary it is to speak in strange languages. I'm not one of those people. I'm just basically one of those people who gets joy and inspiration from people of multitudinal activities who are doing care for place and in a bioregional context in lots of different ways. And to conclude, I've learned so far that 95% of the most effective carers for place are already out there, but maybe they use other names. A carer, the neighbor, the host, the farmer, the librarian, the colleague, the friend. These are individuals in unique places. We all know who they are. We hope that we know where we can find them. So the question about what has this design got to offer bioregioning is, I would slightly change the question and say, what can design offer these individuals in their multitude, in their myriad practices that can help them do what they're doing better? And then my final point is, if we're looking for people who already know how to do bioregioning, there are, and this is where I'm speaking to people who know more than me, I think there's something like 2 billion people around the world whose everyday needs and activities are met through natural resources, knowledge of place, care for place, solidarity, working with forests and fishes and water and pastures and wild game. They know already today how to do bioregioning. So my conclusion for the designers here and the designers you might want to go, we can offer a lot, but we are just going to be an addition to the mixture rather than the answer itself. So that's my, thank you, 10 minutes and a bit.
Thank you so much, John. That was a wonderful short introduction to your thinking about the role of design. And just for the record, it was the wonderful John and James who chose to have a very short intro talk, and then we'll have a longer discussion through questions and exploration. So thank you so much, John. I'm now going to invite James, and I'll spotlight him to come and join us. And I'll take the spotlight off John and myself, but we'll come back in just a moment. James, if you'd like to share some thoughts with us about what is this design stuff and how can it help people do bioregional stuff? So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm James Oliver. I'm based here in the outskirts of Melbourne on the foothills of the Dandenong Ranges. This is Wairarung country, people of the Wairarung language group, so I pay my respects there to elders and past, present, and emerging. Also, acknowledge the knowledge that's in the room here already. If there are any Indigenous colleagues, compatriots, I acknowledge that. And in general, acknowledge that everyone has their own expertise and their own place that they're coming from. I'm not necessarily going to directly answer the question, except in part I am going to repeat some of the comments from John. John, thank you for your comments. I'm going to bring your attention actually to an article John wrote called Bioregioning, Pathways to Urban-Rural Reconnection. And within that, you'll find some of what John has already said there and some pointers to this sort of that local action John was talking about. But by way of summary of what I agree with is where I might start. And not that I disagree with John. John and I have great conversations, but perhaps I'll diverge a little bit to a slightly different narrative after flagging what I do agree with in relation to what is this relationship between design and bioregioning. So first of all, I'm going to quote a few paragraphs from John. John, apologies. Bioregions are not just geographic locales. They embody the interconnection of our minds and natures at a molecular, atomic, and hormonal level. A bioregion, in this sense, repairs the unity of mind and world that has been fractured by modernity. A bioregion is literally and etymologically a life place, in the words of Robert Thayer. And just as ecological systems are unique to each place, so too are the social assets of a bioregion, the individuals, groups, networks, and cultures that make up what Cormac Russell calls its associational life. And because value is created in a bioregion by the stewardship of living systems rather than the extraction of natural resources, a bioregion frames the next economy. I might just want to emphasize that relationship maybe at this pause, that sort of relationship between bioregion and economy. The design of connections between places, communities, and nature is widespread and accelerating. These new undertakings may be diverse, but a green thread connects them. The understanding that caring for the health of a place and of the persons who inhabit it are parts of one story. With this care for place as their frame, communities are connecting the what is with the what if. So that's broadly another way, in John's own words, of saying what John has already said. But I think I totally recommend this article, by the way. One other thing I want to just quote from it, because bioregions in the context of the local also are not unconnected to the global. And there's in terms of design, there's been a lot of shift towards systems thinking, for example. And just one final quote from this article. System change is the consequence of multiple interacting processes and events that unfold at different tempos. The German word Eigenzeit, proper time, describes the phenomenon. A bacterium, a forest, or an economy, again, economy, each have very different timescales of change, but they are all interconnected. Yeah, I just wanted to share those words. I wouldn't describe myself as a designer per se. I guess I think of myself as an educator, writer, researcher, maybe activist. What design is a big question mark for me. What any disciplinarity is often a big question mark for me. I guess I would align more with a transdisciplinary kind of paradigm, but more so with an Indigenous knowledges and research paradigm. I am myself from a place that I would describe as an Indigenous community and culture in the Scottish Hebrides, where we have our own land and language protections and provisions, and I grew up in that Gaelic world with those relationships. So, art and design and architecture, these kind of professionalized concepts are not necessarily so distinct from each other. So the relationship between design and practice, between design and making, between design and just doing or being, I think is a point to make. So there's a sort of action-orientedness maybe towards what we might broadly agree on what design means, but for that matter, maybe also in what education and research should even mean. And for me, that largely is about bringing things into relation. So what are we privileging or prioritizing when we bring things into relation? Also, I mentioned systems thinking that's become prevalent in design. Also, might use a bit of jargon here, apologies, but talk about the ontological turn, which some of you may or may not have heard of, but broadly within design, that's thinking, and not just in design, but in academia generally, the sort of ontological turn can refer to a big spectrum of things, such as decolonial approaches through to more than human approaches and action and research related to that. But loosely, there's been a shift towards respecting and valuing differently oriented and differently situated worldviews and lived experience. Other word for that might be cosmovision in the Latin American context, or in my own context, we might refer to this as a concept called duchas, which is about that relationship of responsibility and, shall we say, care, as John mentioned already, for the environment and obligations to it, belonging to it, and the longing that comes from that belonging, again, towards concepts such as care, which is not unusual, particularly necessarily in any part of the world where there is any sort of lived continuity of lived experience with place that might challenge industrialized or extractive modes of taking control of how we access place, for example. My emphasis here, I guess, going back to this bringing into relations, how design might be that, how bioregioning is actually about acknowledging that there is a whole set of relations, that they are not just economic value, but actually a valuing of relationships. So maybe, given that it's a half past already, Michelle, that's where I will stop. But I just wanted to, yeah, maybe that's all I think I needed to do.
Thank you so much. Yes, that was lovely, James. And I hope we can get a chance uh, to talk about your experiences as someone who's got your own land and language in a faraway place from Australia, who's still grappling with the impacts of colonisation, as many people in Australia are. So I hope we can get to that. If not today, then certainly in another conversation. But thank you so much to both of you for really concise and rich overviews of bioregioning and design. And I really want to acknowledge, I can see people like Kieran Kashyap and others on this call who I respect deeply and are also designers. Please do write in the chat, Kieran, if you've got any questions or comments into this whole discussion. And a shout out for Kieran and Regen Sydney for the lovely work that they're doing at that community and bioregional level. So, what I'd like to do with our first little discussion is to dig a little bit deeper into the world of design. And I'm going to be a little cheeky. So, my background was originally politics, history, and law. And throughout your earth centered life, you become much more multidisciplinary. And eventually, if you're very lucky, you completely shed all those Western labels and just figure, how do we keep the place alive? But I have to confess, I only got introduced to the sort of big world of design and designers in the last 5 years. It wasn't something that came up on my radar in the sort of environmental law, governance, regulatory world, and that could be my own lack of connections with those kinds of professions. But let's talk a bit more for those of us who don't know much about design, and I'll be provocative. Why are there so many designers in the bioregional and regenerative world? You'd think it would be full of scientists, but a lot of the people with the fabulous gumph and the wonderful websites, they're often designers. Tell me more. Why is it so? John?
I'm not 100% sure I know where all those people came from. I think there is a sense in which the design world or the design ecosystem is very complicated. Lots of people have different professions and specialisms, which, like in any other group, they tend to defend with quite a lot of militancy. And so if you talk to somebody called an interaction designer, will consider themselves to be totally different from a landscape architect. So yeah, I would say that the way that people organize themselves into tribes is something you find across disciplines and across human societies. And I should, with the prefix that I'm not a designer myself, I've spent more than 40 years hanging around on the edges of these different communities. And I spent the first 20 years being very frustrated and irritated by this tendency to cluster in specialisms that most people don't know what they mean. But I decided that people need it. And in a very fast changing, complex world, and particularly a very challenging one now, people find security and meaning in tribes. And that applies to the design world as everywhere else. So in the bioregional space, if we can call it that, there are groups of people who are very passionate about, I don't know, designing cryptocurrency systems or designing governance systems or designing other things. They form a cluster. They have very intense conversations about models and schemes and strategies. And they tend to do that at the exclusion of other people who, like yourself, might know a tiny bit more about it. But the point is, I don't think this is unique to design. I don't know so many lawyers, but I think lawyers have tribes. I know that urban planners have tribes, geographers have tribes. I think, what do you say, geologians? I suspect geologians have tribes as well. I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I don't think one needs to fight tribalism, but more, my job, I think, and with James, I'm sure is the same, find practical ways to get the different subject groups to talk to each other in a place, and then they'll quickly forget their tribal kind of distractions.
I love that. Joining up the tribes sounds very good. That's the kind of thing I love to explore. James, would you agree? Is this a tribalism thing? And have I just wandered into a foreign tribe and I'm just starting to get to know the language? Or what's going on?
It's not unrelated to another word flagged twice in my preamble, the economy, which is that wherever there is attention given by the public sector to a thing, money tends to flow to that. And what are the most efficient ways to use that money for consultation processes, for community kind of participation, that kind of thing? Yeah, and design has been very adept in that space with the influence of design thinking, and someone's already mentioned co-design in the chat there as a perceived method of choice in the public sector as well. And none of that is like malicious. It's all actually authentic, a kind of activity, but it's also is fundamentally a political economy, I would argue. But more than that, there's also this sort of what design has always been good at, whether it's in the sort of let's say, social dimensions of its application, which has grown with with shifts in how we perceive democracy and policy and funding. But even before that, design was always positioned as a problem-solving discipline. So I think the urgency of a problem, again, both those things you can imagine in inverted commas, because urgent to whom and what terms? A problem for whom and in what terms? And the reality is that if you flip that, we also deal often in the public sector and the public sphere or community levels also with the problem of urgency, to flip the phrase. And the problem of urgency is definitely one that is very tied up with modernity and industrialized efficiency modes of capital and exploitation and profiteering. John's going to say.
Thank
I
you.
would just
Yes,
add
John.
there that I don't know how many people here think that there's vast numbers of designers involved in bioregioning. I'm not sure that I would. It's not my impression. I think a lot of people, designers, along with lots of other people, what I said in my introductory comments, are looking for ways to reconnect you because of some instinct that they're horribly disconnected from something important, i.e. life, but they don't have a terribly effective or resolved way to do that. When James talks about political economy, I think a lot of designers are saying, yes, we must get into the care for space place. They get into that kind of frame of mind, and then they discover it's quite a complicated thing to do. And in particular, there's no business model to pay them to do it. So designers have learned to be good, as James said, at finding ways to charge people money for doing designerly things. Caring for place is not, in general, a business sector at the moment. There are lots of people looking for that, but I think designers are struggling, along with everybody else, to say, I need to spend rather a lot of time learning about this place, getting to meet people I don't know, figuring out how I can be useful, figuring out who I need to work with. Lots of things need to be figured out, none of which they will be paid to do. And so there's a whole discussion, not really limited to design, about, James talks about public sector funding, the whole world of investment and the social impact community, the nature finance, that whole thing. Then the same predicament of saying nature is very important, we must look after it, but then they get a bit closer and discover it's not so easy. It's not so easy even if you don't need to be paid for it. But if you need to earn a living and get a livelihood, it's extremely challenging, which is, I think, where we are now. And it's the people you observe piling at a bioregioning are probably drifting off around the edges if they can't figure out how to get somebody to fund it. So without, just to be pragmatic, it's not some vast world of bioregional design that you've only just discovered. I think it's lots of individuals around the edges of your world also.
No, that's lovely. Thank you. And I think that you've both summed up a number of the issues that are important to realize, is that there are lots of different groups of humans, particularly in the kind of Western industrialized constructed discipline, I am a lawyer or I am a designer, all looking at different issues. And perhaps the good thing is these days more and more of us are all colliding with each other, which is the whole point. And the political economy aspect, certainly we see that in Australia, the regenerative ag, regenerative finance, regenerative everything, and it all links to some kind of economic basis for how do we shift our value system. Perhaps I could also suggest one thing I like about the design world, although I have provocative questions, I love the design world, the little bits I know about it and the more I'm learning, is that it does offer a holistic or integrated way of bringing all the good stuff together. And that's very much what we're certainly interested in AELA, rather than just coming at it from an economic or a legal perspective, looking across the whole issue of how you bring people together. Before I jump to some questions from our lovely audience, I wonder if we could just cast your minds into one or two examples of where either designers or a design process has contributed either to bioregioning or something to do with localisation of economies or regeneration of land, particularly for those of us who are new to the world of what design can offer, because I know that a lot of people on our webinar today would be either actively involved in local projects or bioregioning. Do us the sales pitch. Tell us why design processes might be groovy, or things that you know that you've observed that have contributed to these projects. Would that be okay?
I think it's a very good question. If I could go first, James. Yes, it's a very fair question. However, I'm not here to advocate for design as the answer to large numbers of questions that we all want answers to. I think design is a very powerful and useful addition to mixtures that are always going to be composed differently depending on the situation. But to give you an example of a practice that I've seen working in the Highlands of Scotland, where James and I both hang out from time to time, there are projects to do with looking after watersheds where designers are part of practices where rediscovery, I'm not sure if it's design or art, to be honest, but people are looking for ways to get people to remember that they did have connections to place. For example, the watersheds of some part of the land that they've forgotten about, but through the medium of maps, through the medium of music, through the medium of geology, through the medium of performance, through the medium of carefully constructed meetings, through the medium of learning journeys, designed experiences which bring people back into contact with their place and their watershed. And what has then becomes mildly remarkable to me is that we get commercial enterprises get that. And for example, there's one example where a whiskey company is putting quite a lot of resources into a watershed cultural program, not because they think they're going to sell more whiskey directly, but because they actually recognize that the social energy and the story of watershed becoming healthier is going to, because they use the same water, will be good for them in the long run. And so this is where designers bring cultural and business interests together in real places. But I think the real place is pretty crucial. It's not just a kind of playing the game of caring. It has to be caring in a place where the kind of daily tasks are real.
Yeah. No, thank you. And as you were saying, that it's bringing them together, it's got to be a real thing. One of our esteemed Indigenous elders in Australia who works with us very closely, Mary Graham, always talks about ethics is a doing thing. Caring for country is a doing thing. It's not just an endless abstraction and discussion and writing papers. It's a doing thing. Thank you, John. And James, do you have any stories or examples that would help people understand the role of design?
And my caveat would be the same. I think designers and design needs to learn how to not do things. Often that is the problem with any expertise that comes in. But there is a privilege of maybe having a perspective and a privilege of some other knowledge. So working with people in relation to that other knowledge and or just respecting that maybe the knowledge on the ground is better than any other knowledge that is coming and how to bridge into other systems. So that sort of proximity is really important, that maybe designers or anyone else coming into a space as a sort of external force for good or development, economic or otherwise, cultural or otherwise practices. These things happen all the time. And like we come up with words like bioregioning and design thinking and these things as if we don't know a lot of this stuff already. So on that theme, I would say that actually I think everyone should just lean into their inner designer and feel that they can be a designer. I didn't like design found me, if you like. I didn't find it. I didn't train in design. Been working in it for a while, but because I work in a place-based manner, design found me. So I think working with is a key dimension of what design can offer anyone in any place, even if designers are involved directly or not. I think if you're going to, regardless of the trademark design thinking or co-design stuff, it's really all about that relationship of collaboration, of working with humans more than humans, and not ignorant of things like political economies or land rights. I think one of the primary tasks, just to finish up referring to what John was talking about earlier, but on the other coast of the Highlands where I'm from, where he was mentioning, basically community-owned land is the number one keystone to any of these questions. And it's the one thing that will facilitate most of the innovations that are possible. The concentration of land ownership in any place is arguably always going to be the number one hurdle to any bioregioning, any cultural development, any ecological, human ecological, environmental project.
No, thank you, James. And that jumps straight into the practicalities of what we face when we're trying to create the kinds of systems and transitions systems change and transitions. In Australia, terrific groups trying to work around the private ownership of land, the private ownership of extractivism. They may have some terrific examples on the ground, but that level of control and challenging the power and the decision making to actually do the transitions, a lot of times people can see what they'd like to achieve. Did you want to talk? I know, James, you're very passionate because some of our discussions before have been about things like community land trusts and ways to actually help remove land from the capitalist or market-based system and make it become, again, in our economic system, what it is, the foundation of life. Did you want to add anything to that or any of the projects you're working on? Not?
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe not the time or place to go too much into that because it could be a big thing, and obviously there's people in the audience. But I do just further to my earlier point there. I think the opportunities and the watershed project that in the Findhorn River area that John was talking about is a really good example. If anyone was to just to go and look at the kind of community and collaborative and creative and economic sometimes oriented micro projects within a bioregion. But in terms of that's also quite a privileged situation that they've managed to take advantage of there as well, in terms of the conditions to achieve that. Other parts, particularly on the west side of Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands, there is just like a lot of layers of entrapment around a sort of perception of land rights and access and ownership, and then an underpinning sort of landlordism that has never gone away for 300 years. That economic relationship forecloses space. So I think this is a key thing. Even you might feel you belong to a place, but even belonging to that place, if there is no space for people to come together to share what that place means for them and how to imagine access to land and or other assets to evolve for community benefit, then I think you're just in a false economy of infrastructure because money gets spent on, yeah, not always the most vital things for a local group to get its own agency. And I think what the connection to my project in Skye is that by reclaiming like ancestral land, which I grew up on, it's not distantly ancestral. I literally went to school there and played on this land, is that I bought it to take it out of the market and basically refuse to have any fencing on it so that anyone can access it. It's pretty much the only place in the local area where you can access the river and or even indeed anyone else's croftland, which you should in theory be able to because it's in theory an open community. It's described as in terms of crofting. And so it's a way the land itself becomes a process of learning in relation to it by just making a space for things to happen. So young people will visit it and do learning field trips. People from overseas, from other indigenous cultures, from the Amazon and Hokkaido, Ainu, North American First Nations. There's a sort of integration of stories happening in that place that if it was all fenced off and enclosed away from any sort of access or participation, then and then connecting that in with an art and design world that I operate in so that you can transcend national boundaries and disciplines means that stories from the land start to reconnect people to the land. That in itself probably needs more and more unpacking, as they say, but really, if people can't stand on the land, I really don't think I saw somebody put a Mary Graham quote up earlier about being located. It's
Yeah.
really hard to know where you are.
And First Peoples of this continent will tell anyone who listens that the land is the source of the law. And if you sit quietly and listen to country, it'll tell you what you need to do. And that you're exactly right, that physicality, if it's lacking, then people, particularly people from my culture in the West, continue to maintain this level of abstraction to overcomplicate to some extent what needs to happen and what needs to be stopped in places to allow country to thrive. So a couple of questions. Thank you so much for that, James. I think it's directly relevant to the whole issue of design. If we can't get to a place, then how do we care for it or design for it? So there's a couple of different questions. I'm going to try to group a few together. Thank you, everyone, for jotting your questions into the chat. I'm going to start with a short question from Michelle. And she's saying, could you comment on the role of permaculture design? Is that something that either of you have been involved in or connected to? And John, you're on mute, just so you know, in case that's helpful.
That's very helpful. I don't have a certificate, but I know a lot of people who have one. And I think it's been an incredibly rich source of insights for me into different ways of caring for land in a physical way rather than just talking about it. I think there's certain aspects of permaculture as a movement which are slightly exclusive, but then aren't we all? I wanted to add on to my short answer about that, this question of land, because I personally think we have to be more direct in answering the question, what are we supposed to do if the land is controlled by enclosures, or as is happening now, all of the money in the world is listening to us talking about how important land is and not buying it all. I think we need to be more clear about what practically we can do to stop land being enclosed even more than it is at the moment, because I don't disagree. Of course it's central, but we can't just say it's important, therefore, and then we talk about something else. I'm going to put into the chat a piece from LinkedIn, which is in French, but you can all know how to translate, from a guy called Frederic Bosquet, who spent the last 12 years just in France looking at the practical ways in which people are inhabiting places where the land ownership question is contested. And what has completely amazed me, and I've been living here for a long time, is the degree to which certain kind of administrative and statutory machines or devices have been invented in response to this public activity that help not at all totally answer the question of land and who owns it, but actually is a sense in which the laws and the infrastructure of the state are responsive when there's a sufficient grassroots activity to trigger it. I won't say any more than that, but if anybody's keen, it's quite an interesting little story about 10 years of what people are doing, which most other people don't know about, including me.
Thank you, John. James, did you have anything to add, or you're okay?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
But no, I totally agree with John there. I did have the pleasure, I'm trying to remember, rack my brain to remember his name. About a decade ago, as part of this art project in Victoria, in regional Victoria here in a town called Avoca, there was this project called the Avoca Project, which was about this house being revitalized on having wrongly been put on a floodplain as a sort of art and climate change kind of project. Anyway, there's amazing, and the various collaborations happened in that house, and there was a man there called, oh, I can't remember his name. I think it was Michael or somebody. I'm sure I can find out. But anyway, he got involved in this project in collaboration as a permaculture practitioner, and he was a gardener, but he was also a poet. And I remember him taking me around his garden and talking about the relationship between the legumes and the mustard tree and everything. And he had a poem, I'm not joking, he had a poem about every single relationship in the permaculture garden he had. I just thought I'd share that as a sort of light-hearted story, but also about his sense of belonging to that practice in relation to that place. And yes, it was a bounded garden, but it was really powerful, like how a human can tell these stories of how what they know about land and nature and the ecology of that and the ecosystem, and how that can in itself translate or transmit to being in the world in a particular way, to communicate with other people in a particular way, and a different kind of ecosystem of creativity and culture going on there. But it's important. If you're doing something like that and you have that knowledge, how do you share it in ways that make other people want to be in relation with it? Because fundamentally, any of these questions or issues that we're raising around about bioregioning or land, saving the planet, what does that mean? But if you can ground people in a relationship with a place and therefore a wider ecosystem of that, of people and relationships, then yeah, I think that's a positive thing. I don't know if that's
No,
right, but
no, thank you, James. I think it's wonderful. And really, you're connecting the idea of bioregional approaches is all about bringing that all together. And the fact that 10 years later, you can barely remember his name, but you were struck by how he had a poem for relationships between legumes and other things. I think that's one of the essential elements of bioregioning, or whatever you want to label it. It's a very Western framework. We've talked about that in some of our other webinars in the past. I should have said at the beginning, we've had many webinars over the past year explaining different aspects, but yeah, thank you. And I actually want to give a plug for Morag Gamble, who's a bit of a permaculture design legend here in Australia. And if you are interested in permaculture, look her up. She runs courses a lot. And I just think that some of the Aussies who are connecting with these ideas are doing a terrific job. I'm going to bring two questions together now. Now, Mark has asked about the Darling Barker River Basin, and what I'd like to do, we're going to go about 5 minutes over the hour for anyone who'd like to stay with us, but if you have to go, we understand. And Mark, at the very end, I'm going to bring up some pictures, because there's been a couple of questions, and to me privately, about Australia's bioregions and how does it all fit together. I'll show you a couple of slides, because the Barker is in fact its own bioregion, not just a catchment, which is really interesting and a little unusual, and it looks really odd on the map, but we'll come to that. What I'd like to do is bring Richard, Michelle, and Kieran Kashap's questions together. I'm going to read them out together, but it's about the political and connecting the bottom-up, top-down stuff. So I'll start with Kieran's comment or question. One of the things he's been thinking about is the mix of bottom-up grassroots and top-down policy levers that could grow bioregionalism. I wonder if you have thoughts on how these different approaches and scales can be navigated. And then I just want to link it to Richard's question, which as a lawyer type, I have given a lot of thought to and just finished a chapter exploring these questions. What are the political and legal design implications of bioregionalism? Is it envisaged that bioregions will replace existing municipal and state boundaries? And there's another couple of questions there. But John and James, would you like to comment on the bottom-up, top-down and the political structures of this wonderful world we live in? John?
I would love to do that. Just to say that what I've learned in the last 5 years is that although we tend to assume that policy and politics and the administration of the modern state are utterly oblivious and disinterested in bioregioning or all the things, it's true as a system, but there are very large numbers of individuals in all of these systems that are actually desperate to do something differently. And what blew my mind just a few months ago was a story from DEFRA, the Department of Agriculture and the Environment in the UK, where a rather senior person said, we need to get all our senior officials thinking about the more than human. It's far too human-centric, it's far too technocratic. And so she commissioned a woman called Phoebe Tickell to organize a kind of an assembly of living beings for senior civil servants in the Department of Agriculture. Just did that, at the end of which all these very kind of grand persons, male and female, said, yes, it's amazing. I never thought about it like that before. I can see we need to take the more than human much more serious centrally into account in our policy making, which isn't to say that the system is transforming magically by itself, just that there are individuals in it. So one of the things that I think designers are quite good at is figuring out who is up for it in doing an experiment. Don't try and sell, it's not a big system solution. Just, would you be up for an experiment? Because Phoebe Tickell is so I will just do an experimental way of meeting and an experimental way of discussing our subject. They're up for experiments, and then they're not confronted by the fact it needs to succeed or fail. So if that's bottom up and top down, it's my partial answer to that. There are people out there in all of these organizations and systems who may appear to be hostile, but then they're not, and you just have to be a bit creative in finding out who they are and giving them in small-ish things to try out.
Thanks, John. James?
The immediate thought is that neither is a one-size-fits-all solution anyway. So every local community is going to have different intersections of power playing out and priorities as a result of that. So how any community comes to its own priorities for some sort of action plan is something people need to get their heads around on the ground. And also the top-down side of things, it just depends, absolutely will always depend on the place, because there are different layers of governance at play, some more visible than others, and maybe it's the invisible ones you need to look at, such as how different pots of money filter down into communities that are not necessarily advertised, for example, that sit within, like nested within other local authority type regimes. That an example, for example, in from where I'm working is how the Crown's estate revenue around the coast and sea systems around the islands gets redistributed via community development fund, and most people have no idea this thing exists. There's little things like that always available. Not that that's an answer per se, but it's a way to start growing something, and then if you've got the top-down bits of money more than the big policy change as the big like only horizon, like you've got to have action happening on the ground. Because if there's no social cohesion towards a shared purpose, then all that happens is we're reproducing the benefits of privatizing and alienating interests, which just becomes a monopoly ultimately.
Mm. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. We're coming up to 5 minutes past the hour. And John and James, if you can bear with me, I'd like to share a couple of maps so that there's about 4 questions that have related to the structure of things, and it's extremely relevant. If you could bear with me, I'm just clicking on the buttons. So in a lot of the presentations I personally do, because I'm such an advocate for place-based, loving your ecosystems and caring for them, we talk about lots of different lenses into some kind of bioregional approach. Obviously, Australia's ancient governance system created and lived by Aboriginal peoples is still in place. And anyone who can catch and there's also the colonial history of Australia and the different ways that governance emerged, which I would suggest are completely not bioregional. Then we have Western science and local approaches to land care. And then we have a whole range of place-based communities and social and economic justice projects. And then our legal and governance structures looking to the future. I know that Fatima asked some questions about who defines bioregions, who has the final say. That is an absolutely liquid question. In most bioregional literature, people will point to there are a multiplicity of ways to define what a bioregion is. There's no one way. And it's often the local communities themselves who will be describing how they live, where they live. This is the Aboriginal map of Australia. We'll come back to it in just a moment. And as Mary Graham talks about, there has been the emergence of a place-based collaborative ecological stewardship system where the worldviews of people were in some ways similar and connected, but the law and the culture, the songlines, the Dreamtime stories, everything was built out from the absolute unique place. And the lack of centralisation, the heterarchical structure of Aboriginal governance, is because it was profoundly what we would say in Western framing, a bioregional governance system. And again, that's a Western framing word. I'm not pretending that anyone in First Peoples groups used that word before. Now, Australia, from a Western science point of view, has 89 bioregions. In this IBRA 7 classification, it's been defined by scientists based on the geology, soils, and predictions of vegetation in those places. So the bioregion is different from a catchment. But first, we've got about 89 bioregions recognised in IBRA 7, the Bioregionalisation 7 scheme. And I think we have 415 or 418 sub-bioregions, so that's different. And they work up from small ecosystems and clusters that are connected through likeness. So it's Mother Nature's way of telling us about herself. But we also have catchments, and a lot of bioregional projects aren't technically Western science bioregions. They're catchment or locale or river systems or a bay or their forest or their mountain. So there's Western science. And what I wanted to show you is I love looking at this map as an Australian because you can see the large bioregions, the 89, you can see the catchments, and then you can see how Aboriginal people organise themselves. And when you look at the sub-regional map, they're very similar. And a lot of Aboriginal people that I've worked with, a lot of mates will define themselves as the Three Rivers people or the such and such mountains people. And they've got their boundaries and they've got their shared spaces. But it's all very wonderful and very beautiful. And it's built out of what Mother Nature is telling us about herself. Versus the colonial history of Australia, where some big straight lines were drawn and they said, here shall be a colony and one day it will be a state and we will now do whatever we want to the place based on all these other hierarchical structures. We give talks about all that stuff inside AELA, but I just wanted to mention that, yes, bioregioning or the bioregional approach is all about place-based love and care, and it's often wrapped up in economic framing these days. And my final little picture, which I hope I can find. No, you don't want to see that. If anyone's interested, pop onto our Greenprints website. It's very basic. It's got a simple overview. And inside the stories place, the Lithgow Greenprints project, if you upload some of the maps, it actually shows you some of the stuff that AELA is interested in, and we're always looking for communities to collaborate with, is to think about how we don't just break it all apart, but how do we bring it all together? Understanding our ecological foundations, our communities, our humans, our services, the economy, what our relationships are, what we're facing into the future, the benchmarks were in the past, and how do we connect it all so that the transitions we're doing aren't just for humans, they're building regenerative economies out of what our ecological foundations need so that we can all live here together. And finally, for Mark Merritt, out of the 89 bioregions, guess what this funny little shape is? That's your Barker Darling. And it's not just a catchment system, it's actually got its own bizarre geology, and it is its own bioregion. And we can talk about that more another day. So I hope that little potted overview, and I personally feel that the visuals of maps are so very important. She says as she struggles to get the buttons working so I can stop sharing. Yes, I don't want to take up any more space, but I really wanted to share that bioregional approaches are up for grabs. It's up for communities to really just fall back in love with their places and try to do their best by working together. So I would like to officially do a huge thank you to John and James. I hope we can have you back for further talks and workshops and hear more about your experiences. But would you like to just have any final words or advice, or sharing a poem about a legume, whatever might light your candle to say goodbye today on this lovely discussion? John?
I will let James compose a haiku about a carrot whilst I say two things. One thing, I would like to continue this discussion under the general heading of what can designers and the design community do for Earth rights and the Earth rights movement? Because
Lovely.
the reason I'm so happy to be here is lots of people are saying, by the way, we need to take, there's lots of other stuff happening. Laws and Earth rights and the rights of nature and the rights of rivers are clearly at the center of what's going to make a material difference. How can we designers contribute to that? So have a think about it, Michelle and your colleagues, and tell us either in one of these sessions or somewhere, because there's people all over the world saying, yeah, okay, it's all very interesting, but what practically can you do to help us? So please, if you can answer that question, it would be very much appreciated.
Would love to. What a wonderful question. Thank you, John. And James, have you got a haiku about a carrot yet?
No, but I do have a thank you. Is that count as a haiku? So yeah, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, John, and thank you for all the amazing chat as well. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I think it's really important evolving conversation. There's so many adaptations and I guess provocations that need to happen at local levels. And part of it is, being in a conversation with places about what is the value of these kind of vocabularies, because it's got to make sense to people on the ground. And going back to the idea that design is a little bit parachute in sometimes, as lawyers are, as whoever is, if they're not directly living by that land. So yeah, what are these conversations leading to in terms of other kind of movements? And I like that language of earth rights. It's a movement. It's not necessarily the thing. Bioregioning is a movement. It's not necessarily the thing. I think that's a really good direction. And the transdisciplinarity of it all is I think it's very visceral, because have the good fortune to go to places like the winter school that John and I attend to, where there's a lot of these land symposiums and watershed kind of events, but the same will be happening all over Australia as well. So how do we somebody talked about bridging theory and practice in the chat earlier. How do we do that in a way that's not just about describing how we do that?
That's a great challenge. Thank you so much. I could chat with you both for about another 5 hours and still not be anywhere near running out of questions. But thank you again for your time, and John for getting up so early. We really appreciate that. Go forth, everyone, and think about your lovely ecosystems. I'm going to close with, I wish I'd thought to show a photo. Yesterday, I was sitting in my office looking out over the flowers I planted, and a massive great carpenter bee, about 10 centimeters large, was buzzing around, and I had to interrupt the meeting I was in to rush out and take photos of it. So if anyone wants to see photos of that particular bee from my particular bioregion, it's the kind of fluffy thing you just want to cuddle. And on that note, for the bees, thank you so much, everybody, for your time. And please stay on the AELA mailing list. We're going to have lots more conversations, and we're ramping up our bioregional work next year. And also, we might actually send out to you a link. The R30 guys and girls from the US are hosting a wonderful international love-in bioregional convergence around the 9th, 10th, 11th of September. I'm giving a talk about the Aussie stuff, just an overview and acknowledging all the great work, but we might send you a link about that. But on that note, John, James, thank you, and I look forward to further discussions. Hooray! And thank you, everybody, for being with us.